The final shovelful of dirt landed with a soft thud on the fresh mound. It was the only sound in a world that had gone silent. Ilara stood with her back straight, not looking at the faces that ringed the small cemetery. They were the faces of Providence Gulch, a town that had been her home for 3 years, and they were already turning away. Her husband, Liam, was in the ground, and with him, every claim she had to this life. Later that day, in the stiff parlor of the Davies Ranch, the air was thick with the smell of beeswax and finality. Mr. Davies, her father-in-law, a man whose face seemed carved from hard granite, did not offer her a seat. He stood before the cold hearth, a legal document in one hand and a small leather pouch in the other. He was the town's foundation, a rancher whose herds covered 3 hillsides and whose word was law. "The law is clear, Ilara," he said, his voice as flat and gray as a winter sky. "With Liam gone, this house, this land, it reverts to the family. You are not family, not by blood." She said nothing. Her throat was a knot of unshed tears and dry dust. She had known this was coming. The whispers had started before the funeral bells had even stopped ringing. He pushed the leather pouch across the polished table. It landed with a dull, insufficient clink. "There are $20 here. More than generous. It will see you to the Eastern Territories on the next stage." He then slid the deed forward. "And this." Liam always had a soft spot for hopeless things. He bought it for a song years ago. "It is yours now. The sump, they call it." A cruel smile touched the corner of his mouth. The sump was a patch of useless, low-lying acreage 5 miles north of town, forgotten by all but the tax rolls. It held the skeletal remains of a barn that had collapsed in a snowstorm a decade prior. It was a place where nothing grew but cattails and regret. Giving it to her was not an act of charity, it was an act of final dismissal, a formal branding of her worthlessness. She looked at the 2 items on the table, a ticket to oblivion or a deed to despair. The faces of the townspeople from the funeral flashed in her mind, the pity from the women, the cold assessment from the men. They expected her to take the money and disappear, to become a sad story told on winter nights. A spark, hard and bright, ignited in the cold emptiness of her grief. It was not hope, it was refusal. She picked up the deed first, her fingers tracing the spidery script. Then she took the pouch of coins. She did not look at Mr. Davies. She turned and walked out of the house that had been her home, leaving the door to swing shut on a life that was now over. Her first and only stop was Gable's Mercantile. The bell above the door announced her arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt like a mockery. Mr. Gable, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest, watched her approach the counter. His eyes held the same watery pity as the others. "Heard what happened, Ilara," he said, polishing a glass jar. "A terrible shame. The stage leaves Thursday. I expect you'll be on it." "I'll need an axe," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "A good one. And a shovel. The sharpest you have." Gable stopped polishing. He looked at the small pouch she placed on the counter. "An axe? What for?" "For my property," she said. He blinked, then a slow understanding dawned on his face, followed by disbelief. "The sump? Child, there's nothing out there but mud and ruin. You can't be thinking of—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Take the stage. Go east. There's nothing for you here now." "The axe," she repeated, untying the pouch, "and the shovel, and 10 pounds of salt." He weighed out her purchases in a heavy silence. The coins she paid him represented nearly all she had left in the world. As he handed her the tools, their handles smooth and foreign in her hands, he gave her one last piece of advice. "You're buying your own tombstone, girl. That land will swallow you whole before the first snow." She shouldered the tools, the weight of the steel and wood a shocking, solid reality. She did not reply. With her back straight, she walked out of the mercantile, leaving the bell to jingle her departure. She did not look back at the town, at the life that had cast her out. She turned her face to the north and began to walk. The journey to the sump was 5 miles of slow, grinding effort. The road dissolved into a muddy track, and the weight of the axe and shovel dug into her shoulder. The landscape grew bleaker with every step. The healthy pines and oaks of the valley gave way to stunted willows and swampy ground. The air grew heavy and damp. She was walking downward, into a basin the rest of the world had wisely built above. When she finally arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows. It was worse than she had imagined. The land was a sodden sponge, crisscrossed with stagnant pools of water. And there, in the center of it, was the barn. It was not a building, it was a carcass. The roof had caved in, its spine broken. The walls listed at drunken angles, great sections of timber having rotted away entirely. It was a monument to failure. A wave of cold dread washed over her, so powerful it buckled her knees. She dropped the tools and sank into the damp grass. Gable was right. Davies was right. The whole town was right. This was a grave. Tears she had refused to shed in the parlor and in the town now came, hot and bitter. She wept for Liam, for the life they had lost, and for the utter, crushing hopelessness of this place. The wind whispered through the broken timbers of the barn, a low, mournful sound that echoed the emptiness inside her. For a long moment, she let the despair take her. But as the last of the sun's light faded, the cold began to seep into her bones. It was a raw, physical reality that cut through the fog of her grief. Dying here in the grass was a choice, a quick one. The alternative was a fight, a slow one. She pushed herself to her feet, her body aching, her resolve a tiny, flickering ember in a vast darkness. She picked up her tools and forced herself to walk toward the ruin. She had to see it all. She circled the structure, her boots sinking into the soft earth. It was a chaotic jumble of splintered wood and rusted metal. But the foundation, she noted, was stone. Great, flat fieldstones, expertly laid by a forgotten builder. They were still solid, a line of order in the surrounding chaos. Inside, the scene was even worse. The great central beam had snapped, bringing the roof down into a tangled mess on the dirt floor. Moonlight streamed through the gaps, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still, cold air. It was hopeless. She was about to turn away, to concede defeat, when her foot caught on something solid under the debris. She knelt and pulled away a rotten plank. Beneath it was not dirt, but a thick slab of wood, bound with iron hinges. A ring was set into it. It was a trapdoor. Liam had mentioned it once, a story he'd heard about the original settlers. They had built a root cellar, he'd said, one so deep you could store a whole harvest and it would still be fresh in the spring. Her heart began to beat a little faster. With a grunt of effort, she heaved at the iron ring. The door was swollen with damp and incredibly heavy. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she pulled with a desperate strength born of having no other option. With a groan of tortured wood, the door lifted a few inches. A wave of cool, dry air, smelling of deep earth and stone, washed over her face. It was a scent not of rot, but of preservation. She worked the shovel under the edge and pried the door fully open. A set of steep stone steps descended into blackness. Taking a splinter of wood and lighting it with the flint and steel from her small pack, she held the makeshift torch over the opening. The sight stole her breath. It was not a cellar. It was a cavern. The flickering light revealed walls not of dirt, but of solid, smooth stone, stretching back further than she could see. The space was immense, easily as large as the barn above it, and high enough for a tall man to stand upright. The air was still and cool, but not the damp, biting cold of the outside. It was a constant, deep earth chill. And at the far end, she heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound. Drip, drip, drip. Water. She descended the steps, her small flame pushing back the shadows. The floor was packed earth, firm and dry. The stone walls were a marvel, fitted together with a skill that was hard to comprehend. This was not a farmer's root cellar. This was a fortress built into the earth. The despair that had crushed her only moments before began to recede, replaced by a grim, calculating resolve. The town saw a worthless sump. Her father-in-law saw a grave. But here, in the cold, dark silence, Elara saw a chance. They had cast her out, but they had unknowingly given her a secret. They had given her stone. The next day began the slow, brutal work of creation. Elara's world shrank to the circle of her labor. Her first priority was shelter. The open barn was a death trap, but one corner of the stone foundation was still square and true, directly over the cellar entrance. She would build her house there, a small room grafted onto the ruin. She started by clearing the wreckage. She used the shovel and her bare hands, hauling splintered beams and rotten planks out into the pale morning light. Her hands, accustomed to needlework and kitchen tasks, were raw and blistered within the first hour. By noon, they were bleeding. She tore strips from her petticoat to wrap them and kept working. The pain was a constant, screaming companion, but she learned to live with it, to push it into a corner of her mind. The good timbers she salvaged, stacking them carefully. They were not enough. She looked to the thin stand of trees at the edge of her property. They were not the proud, straight pines of the high country, but they would have to do. Wielding the axe was a clumsy, exhausting ordeal. Her first few swings barely bit into the bark. Her arms felt like lead, her back a column of fire. But she remembered watching Liam and the other men, the way they let the weight of the axe head do the work. She adjusted her grip, found a rhythm, and slowly, chip by chip, the tree began to yield. When it finally fell with a shuddering crash, she felt a surge of triumph so fierce it made her dizzy. Getting the log back to the barn was another war. She pushed, pulled, and rolled it over the uneven ground, her boots sinking in mud. It took hours. One log. She needed dozens. The sheer scale of the task was crushing, but she focused only on the next step, the next swing of the axe, the next inch of progress. Her days became a blur of relentless physical effort. She woke at dawn, her body a single, unified ache. She worked until the light failed, her muscles trembling with exhaustion. She would eat a meager meal of hard bread and salted meat, then descend into the cellar to sleep, where the cold was less biting. Slowly, agonizingly, a structure began to rise. She laid the salvaged foundation logs first, then began to notch and fit the new ones she had felled. Her first few corners were clumsy, the gaps wide. She learned through failure, tearing down her own work and starting again. She discovered a deposit of clay near a creek bed and taught herself to mix it with dry grass and water, creating a rough chinking to seal the gaps between the logs. Each sealed crack was a victory against the wind. While the walls went up, she worked on her other systems, weaving the tasks together in a tapestry of survival. The cellar was the heart of it all. It was more than a shelter. It was a garden, a well, and a pantry. Every evening, by the light of a crude tallow lamp, she worked to tame the subterranean space. She followed the dripping sound to its source, a tiny fissure in the rock face at the far end of the cavern, where clean, cold water seeped out and pooled on the floor. She spent a week carving a shallow channel in the packed earth with a sharp stone, directing the flow to a natural depression. Then, she made dozens of trips to the creek, hauling back buckets of heavy, wet clay. She lined the depression with the clay, packing it down until it was smooth and watertight. When it dried, she had a small cistern, a permanent source of fresh water, hidden from the sun and safe from the winter's freeze. It was a miracle. Next came the garden. The town laughed at the idea of farming the sump. But Ilara wasn't planning to farm the surface. She began the back-breaking task of hauling the rich topsoil from the land above down into the cellar, one bucket at a time. She built low-walled beds from flat stones, filling them with the dark, fertile earth. Her world was an endless loop of stairs, down with an empty bucket, up with a full one. Her legs grew hard as iron, her back strong. When the beds were ready, she made her first trip back to Providence Gulch. Walking into Gable's Mercantile felt like walking onto a stage. The handful of customers fell silent. All eyes were on her. She was thinner, her face weathered, her hands calloused and scarred. She looked like a wild thing. Mr. Gable polished the counter with a nervous energy. "Well, look what the wind blew in," he said, forcing a jovial tone. "Thought that swamp had eaten you for sure." "I need supplies," Ilara said, ignoring the whispers. "Seed potatoes, 50 pounds, and onion sets, and carrot seed." A chuckle rippled through the store. Gable leaned forward. "Potatoes? Girl, you can't plant in that muck. They'll rot before they sprout." "And I'll take 2 chickens," she added, laying her carefully saved coins on the counter. "And a goat, if you know of one for sale." The laughter was louder now. The idea was absurd. A woman with no farm, no pasture, buying livestock. But her money was good. Gable sold her the seeds and directed her to a farmer who had a pregnant goat for sale, cheap. As she left, leading her small, noisy flock, she heard someone mutter the name that would stick to her for months: the Sump Witch. Leading the animals back was a trial. The goat was stubborn. The chickens panicked. But she got them there, securing them in a small, sturdy pen she had built inside the barn, right next to her own small living space. Their soft sounds and warmth were a comfort in the vast silence. That night she planted her first crop. By the dim glow of her lamp, deep beneath the earth, she pushed the seed potatoes into the rich soil she had carried. It was an act of faith in a world that had given her no reason for it. One evening, as she was banking the fire, a new sound came from the darkness, a low growl. She froze, grabbing the axe. At the edge of the firelight stood a dog. It was a large, gaunt creature, its fur matted with burrs, a long scar tracing the line of its ribs. It was starving and wary, but it did not snarl. It watched her with intelligent, tired eyes. She took a piece of her salted meat and tossed it. The dog snatched it from the air. She tossed another. It stayed for an hour, a silent shadow just beyond the light, before melting back into the night. It returned the next night, and the next. On the 4th night, it lay down by the fire, sighed, and went to sleep. She named him Shadow. He became her constant companion, a silent, warm presence in the crushing solitude. The mockery from the town was a distant noise, but it was persistent. Mr. Davies made it his business to ride out to her land one crisp autumn afternoon. He sat atop his fine horse, looking down at the patched-together shelter, the small stack of firewood, the thin curl of smoke rising from her chimney. He did not dismount. "A fine castle you've built," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I give you a month. Once the first real storm hits, this pile of sticks will fold, and the wolves will find you." Ilara was splitting wood, the axe now an extension of her arm. She paused, sank the blade into the chopping block, and looked up at him. "The foundation is stone," she said simply. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Stone sinks in a sump, girl. You're a fool. Liam's folly will be your end." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving the insult to hang in the air. The town adopted his certainty. She became a cautionary tale, the widow's folly. The women pitied her stubbornness. The men made wagers on how long she would last. But Elara did not hear them. Her world had shrunk to the rhythms of survival. Winter came, not with a gentle dusting of snow, but like a hammer. An early blizzard descended on the valley, a white fury that howled for 3 days. In Providence Gulch, roofs creaked under the weight of the snow. Awnings were torn from storefronts. Livestock, caught out in the fields, froze where they stood. Inside her small shelter, Elara was warm. The stone fireplace, built with painstaking care, drew perfectly. The immense thermal mass of the foundation and the cellar below absorbed the heat, radiating it back steadily. The wind screamed outside, but inside her small, solid room, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the soft clucking of the chickens, and the steady breathing of shadow at her feet. She was not just surviving the storm, she was living in its heart, untouched. Deep in the earth below, insulated from the fury on the surface, her secret garden was thriving. Pale green shoots pushed up from the dark soil. Shielded from the frost, nourished by the constant cool and the water from the seep, her potatoes were growing. In the deepest, darkest part of winter, in a place everyone called worthless, Elara was tending a crop of pure, impossible life. The solitude was immense, a physical weight. But it was not lonely. It was a kingdom of her own making, quiet and orderly and warm. The blizzard was only a preview. The true crisis arrived in late spring, carried on a warm, ominous breeze. It began as a low hum, a distant vibration that grew until it filled the air. Then the sky darkened. It was not a storm cloud. It was a living, breathing, chittering cloud of locusts. They descended on Providence Gulch like a biblical plague. The sun was blotted out. The air became a thick, crawling curtain of bodies and the deafening sound of millions of clicking, chewing insects. They covered everything. They stripped the fresh green shoots from the fields in minutes. They devoured the leaves from the trees, leaving behind skeletal branches. The town's kitchen gardens, the hope of the coming season, vanished in a single, horrifying afternoon. The people of Providence Gulch fought back with smoke and noise and desperation, but it was like trying to fight the tide with a broom. The swarm was a force of nature, mindless and absolute. For 2 days, the world was a nightmare of crawling, flying hunger. And then, as quickly as they had come, they were gone, leaving behind a landscape of shocking barrenness. Every green thing was gone. The valley looked as if it had been scoured by fire. A stunned silence fell over the town. The entire spring planting was annihilated. The hayfields that were meant to feed the livestock through the next winter were bare dirt. Panic began to curdle in the air. Their carefully laid plans, their generational knowledge of seasons and planting, had been wiped out. And to compound the disaster, the locusts were followed by a vicious, unseasonable deep freeze. A hard frost settled over the ravaged land for a week, killing any root or hardy weed the locusts had missed. It shattered any hope of replanting. The town's winter stores were all they had, and they knew, with a dawning, sickening certainty, it would not be enough. In her hollow, Elara had been spared the worst. The locusts had stripped the trees on her land and consumed the wild grasses, but her fortress was untouched. Her small flock was safe inside the barn. Her firewood was stacked and dry. And deep underground, her impossible garden continued to grow, oblivious to the devastation on the surface. Her systems held. The world outside had turned hostile and alien, but her small, ordered universe remained intact. She was not fighting the chaos, she was simply living outside its reach. The weeks that followed were grim in Providence Gulch. Rations were cut. The faces on the street grew thin and pinched. The usual neighborly cheer was replaced by a guarded, anxious silence. Mr. Gable's mercantile shelves grew barer by the day. What little flour and salted meat he had were sold at prices that broke hearts. Mr. Davies' vast herds of cattle began to suffer, their ribs showing as the ravaged pastures offered no sustenance. The confidence of the town, its bedrock belief in its own rugged competence, had been shattered. One evening, as a cold rain lashed against her small window, Elara heard a frantic banging on her door. It was a sound so alien in her solitary world that she froze. Shadow was already on his feet, a low, rumbling growl in his chest. Cautiously, she lifted the bar from the door and opened it a crack. A woman stood there, drenched and shivering, her face a mask of desperation. It was Sarah Gable, the mercantile owner's daughter. She was holding a small, blanket-wrapped bundle. "Please," the woman sobbed, her voice cracking. "It's my boy. He's sick. The fever won't break, and he's so weak. He won't eat the dried biscuit. There's nothing else." Her eyes, wide and pleading, met Ilara's. They whisper that the storm didn't take everything from you. They call you the Sump Witch. They say you have food." Elara stood motionless in the doorway. The face of Mr. Gable flashed in her mind, his condescending smile, his mocking words. "You're buying your own tombstone, girl." The memory was a bitter taste in her mouth. Here was the fruit of that mockery, a desperate woman begging at the door of the fool she'd been sent to die. It would be so easy to say no, to close the door and preserve the precious resources she had bled for. The thought was a cold, satisfying stone in her gut. But then she looked at the small bundle in Sarah's arms. A tiny, wheezing sound escaped the blankets. A child. A sick child who had done nothing, who knew nothing of pride or scorn. Her choice was not about punishing Mr. Gable. It was about the small, fragile life shivering on her doorstep. The moral calculus was stark and simple. She had food. The child did not. Without a word, Elara stepped back and opened the door wider, letting Sarah into the warmth. She pointed to a stool by the fire. "Sit." She took a lamp, lifted the heavy trap door, and descended into the cool, earthy dark of her cellar. A moment later she returned, her arms full. She placed a half-dozen large, firm potatoes and a string of onions on the table. They looked pale and strange in the firelight, like treasures from another world. Sarah Gable stared at them, her eyes filling with tears. "How?" she whispered. "Everything is gone. How do you have this?" "The ground is generous," Elara said, pushing a burlap sack toward her. "Take them. Boil them with salt. Make a broth for the boy." The woman stumbled to her feet, clutching the sack as if it were solid gold. She tried to speak, to thank her, but only choked sobs came out. She fled back into the rainy night, leaving Elara alone with the fire, the sleeping dog, and the profound silence of her choice. The sack of potatoes was a thunderclap in Providence Gulch. Sarah Gable's story spread from house to house on whispers of disbelief and hope. The Sump Witch, the widow's folly, the woman they had left for dead, had food. 2 days later, a delegation arrived. It was not one desperate mother, but 3 men, their shoulders slumped with the weight of their town's hunger. Mr. Gable led them. His face was gray, the smug confidence gone, replaced by a deep, weary shame. Beside him stood the town mayor and another rancher whose lands bordered the Davies. They stopped before her small, sturdy home, looking at the solid walls, the well-stacked woodpile, the smoke rising steadily from the chimney. They had come expecting a squalid hovel, a lucky cache of roots dug from the mud. This quiet, ordered homestead did not fit the narrative of the madwoman in the swamp. Ilara met them at the door. She did not invite them in. She simply waited. It was Gable who spoke first, his voice rough. He did not meet her eyes. "My grandson, he took the broth. His fever broke this morning." He swallowed hard. "My daughter said, she said you have more." Ilara looked at the three men, at their proud, broken faces. She saw the hunger of a whole town in their eyes. She nodded once, then turned and walked inside. They followed, hesitantly, stepping into the warmth. Their shock was immediate and profound. They stopped just inside the door, their eyes wide. They saw the neat, clean room, the healthy chickens cooing in their pen, the goat watching them with placid curiosity. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and baked bread. It was a sanctuary, an impossible pocket of life and order in a dead world. They looked at each other, their shared memory of this place as a collapsed ruin warring with the reality before them. "My God," the mayor whispered, running a hand over the smooth, chinked logs of the wall. Ilara ignored their astonishment. She walked to the center of the room, bent down, and heaved open the trap door. A wave of cool, earthy air rose to meet them. She lit a lantern and gestured for them to look. One by one, they peered down into the darkness, their faces illuminated by the lantern's glow. What they saw silenced them completely. Below them, stretching out in the darkness, were rows upon rows of green, thriving plants. A vast, hidden garden, alive and flourishing. They saw the glint of water in her cistern, the neat stacks of harvested potatoes in a corner, the pale onions hanging in braids from a suspended pole. They were staring at a miracle. Mr. Gable slowly straightened up, his face pale. He looked from the impossible bounty in the cellar to the quiet woman standing before him. He finally met her gaze, and in his eyes was the shattering weight of his own foolishness. "We were wrong," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We called you a fool. We laughed at you. We left you out here to die." He shook his head, a look of profound awe on his face. "My God, we were the fools. We were the fools all along." Ilara listened to his confession, her expression unreadable. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." The victory was plain enough in the green leaves and full potato bins. It needed no commentary. She simply pointed toward a stack of empty burlap sacks by the door. "There is food," she said, her voice calm and even. "Take what you need for your families. The children first." Her quiet grace was more powerful than any rebuke. It stripped away the last of their pride, leaving only a raw, humbling gratitude. They did not just see a survivor, they saw a leader. The cellar became the town's lifeline. Ilara did not simply give away her harvest, she organized it. She instituted a strict rationing system, ensuring that every family got a share, with the sick and the children receiving priority. The men who had once mocked her now came to her door, hats in hand, to receive their family's allotment of potatoes and onions. They saw the quiet efficiency of her homestead, the intelligence behind every system she had built. She taught them. She brought small groups to her land and showed them the principles of her stone-lined walls, her thermal mass heating, her subterranean cistern. She explained how the constant temperature of the earth protected the plants from the frost that had killed everything on the surface. Her knowledge, born of desperation and hard labor, became the town's most valuable commodity. One day, even Mr. Davies appeared. He did not come on his fine horse, but on foot, leading a gaunt-looking milk cow. His own vast stores were gone, his cattle starving. He stood before her, the granite of his face cracked with humility, and offered to trade the cow for a wagon load of her potatoes to feed his herd. Ilara looked at the man who had exiled her, who had wished for her failure. She looked at the hungry animal beside him. Then she nodded and told him where to load the wagon. The transaction was completed in near silence, but it signaled the final collapse of the old order. When the long, hard winter finally broke, the people of Providence Gulch did not forget. They came to her, not with pleas for food, but with tools and timber. Led by the mayor and Mr. Gable, they helped her rebuild the rest of the barn, raising the great central beam and laying a new, solid roof over the whole structure. They worked with a reverence, as if they were building a church. They no longer called her land the Sump or the Widow's Folly. It was known now as Providence Farm, the place that had saved them. Her story spread through the territories, carried by travelers and traders. The tale of the outcast widow who grew a garden underground became a local legend, a testament to resilience. Inspired by her example, other families began to dig deeper cellars, lining them with stone and finding ways to cultivate them. The architecture of the valley began to change, becoming more resilient, more attuned to the harsh realities of the land. Her homestead became a landmark, a place people visited to learn and to remember. She never sought power or position, but she became the quiet, unshakable heart of the community. Years later, Cellar would often stand at the door of her finished barn in the evening, Shadow's aging head resting on her knee. She would look out over the valley, now dotted with homes whose designs bore the mark of her influence. She had been stripped of everything: her husband, her home, her name. The world had given her a pile of rock and mud and expected her to vanish. But from that rock she had built a foundation. From that mud she had grown life. Her legacy was not written in a will or carved on a tombstone. It was in the full pantries of her neighbors, in the smoke rising from their chimneys on a cold winter's night, and in the quiet strength of a community that had learned the difference between what is worthless and what is priceless.